Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here, and in today's build video, we're going to talk about something important because if you have a war game with trenches, you have got to have barbed wire. Now, originally, I was going to take my barbed wire sections and attach them directly to the trenches, but I'm glad that I didn't do that. I went with a more modular approach, which I think is better for gameplay, and it's a lot better for stacking and storage of the trenches when they're not in use. Now, I decided to go with two different styles of barbed wire for my game board. I went with the spiral pickets, which are pretty historically accurate for World War I, and then I have some cross barriers, which are a little more Trench Crusade aesthetic. Both of these are fairly simple to put together, and I want to show you how, so let's get started. The first thing to do is make a jig to bend the wires. 3 nails were driven into a block of wood and the heads of each could be trimmed away. Approximate placement for these is about 3/8 of an inch apart. I also add a lead hole at the top to hold the wire. Then using some 18 gauge steel wire, it is inserted into the top hole and then wrapped around each nail, creating these small loops. And it's a pretty decent representation of a scaled spiral picket. As a base for the modular terrain, I'm going to be using some black PVC board. To build up the groundwork, I'm going to be using some cork sheeting. This is traced and cut out to match the shape and size of the PVC board. The board is cut to approximately 4 inches in length, but of course you can make this whatever size you would like. I use some pliers to remove some of the cork from the edge to give it a more contoured appearance. Then some Starbond medium gel can be applied and the two materials can be glued together. The wires were then evenly spaced and inserted into the cork using some super glue and accelerator. For the barbed wire, I was able to find some double-strand security wire on AliExpress. I put the search words I used to find this in the video description below. To get the correct shape, the wire was wrapped around a dowel and then inserted through the pickets. Unlike barbed wire you see nowadays, you don't want this to look perfect. During World War I, it was very haphazard, making it much more difficult to cut and get through. So just bend the wires back and forth and run it through the pickets and make something that looks good to you. To cover the cork and give it a more earth-like appearance, I'm going to be using some Vallejo mud. Now the color of this doesn't really matter because it's going to be painted in the end. For some more thematic barbed wire obstacles, I'm going to be using some 3D printed crosses. These are from Diceverse over on My Mini Factory. Just like the pickets, cork is going to be used for the ground cover, and these are going to be attached to some 28mm bases. I create a small hole in the cork using a pick, and then the base of the cross can be glued into place. To give these crosses the look of a barrier, I'm going to be using some coffee stir sticks. The wooden sticks can easily be glued to the back of the crosses using some super glue and accelerator. Now with this piece, I wanted more of a haphazard kind of look to it, so the wood is crisscrossed over each other, making it look as though it was quickly assembled. To give some variety to the board, I didn't want all the obstacles to be exactly 4 inches, so these got moved down to 3. But the same process is applied to these pieces as well, gluing the small sticks to the back side. Now I use some 3D printed crosses here, but you of course could make these out of some balsa wood or additional coffee stir sticks. More of that security wire is going to be cut and used on these sections as well. And I wanted the barbed wire on these sections to be even more random than it was on the pickets, giving it more of that extreme fantasy look. I also varied the diameter of the barbed wire, changing to different sizes of PVC pipes or dowels that I'm using. Wanting to customize the bases even more, I added one of the half skulls from StormForge minis over on My Mini Factory. The same Vallejo mud was also applied to the cork here as well. Now this stuff does dry fairly quick, so if you do get on the base, I would recommend to wipe it away as soon as possible. Now I had originally toyed with adding these directly to the trench sections that I had already fabricated, but I think having them modular is a much better idea for gameplay, and it makes stacking the trench sections and storing them a heck of a lot easier. Now at this point the wire is still pretty loose and can be easily moved around, so I use some very small dabs of super glue and accelerator to tack them into place. At this point I had finally made a decision to stain the wood to match the duck boards. This probably would have been better to do before I added the wire, so learn from my mistake. Additional wood stain was also brushed onto the dried Vallejo mud. This allowed it to seep down into the crevices and darken the surface. Before I move on to paint, I did use a hairdryer to speed up that dry time, and I also sealed it using some Valspar flat. Liquitex Heavy Body Mars Black and Burnt Sienna are going to be mixed together. These are going to be used as the first base for the crosses. And if you get some of this on the barbed wire, that's no problem. I specifically added it in places to start that rust simulation. As a highlight layer for the crosses, I'm going to be mixing together some Liquitex Heavy Body Raw Sienna and Parchment. A very minimal amount of water is going to be added to this, so that the pigment can be dry brushed onto the surface, leaving the recesses dark. A higher concentration of the Mars Black and Burnt Sienna was then added to the roof shingles. Dirty Down Rust will now be applied to the barbed wire. Because of the acrylics that I laid down earlier, this just helps reinforce those colors even more. And here you can see how it just adds to that overall menacing look and feel. The Dirty Down Rust is also applied to the wire on the pikes, making sure to have more of a concentration around the loops where water would pool. Using some Liquitex Heavy Body Iridescent Rich Silver, I could then go back and highlight specific areas on the barbed wire. This light and dark from the paint and the rust gives a really good combination to the overall piece and makes it more visually interesting. The skull at the base of one of the pieces also needs to be painted, so I watered down some Liquitex Heavy Body Parchment and mixed that with some of the Burnt Sienna. This was applied as a light wash at first, picking out the highlights, but gradually moving to a more opaque version of the parchment. With these barbed wire pieces done, they can be added to the game board. I like the contrast of the two different types of barbed wire, one being used more prominently by armies on one side versus the other. You could also use the different styles to determine if a type of terrain is difficult, dangerous, or impassable. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Be sure to like, comment, and swing back by for more.